Hey everybody, welcome to this week's show of YouTube Developers Live. I'm Jeff Posnick, coming to you from New York City. I'm a member of the Developer Relations team, and this week I'm really excited to talk to you about different ways of customizing the YouTube embedded player. Before I get started though, I want a couple of ground rules to kind of just talk about what we're going to be covering in today's show. There are a lot of different embedded players and there's lots of different ways to customize them, but for this particular show, we're going to be focusing on customizing the iframe embedded player, which is our current recommended way of embedding videos on web pages. And we're going to specifically focus on the options that are most relevant for desktop web browsers. A lot of these customization options we'll talk about do have some effect with mobile browser playback, but not all of them do. And we're going to kind of just focus today on how these options affect desktop playback. Another thing that we're not going to be covering today is using the JavaScript API for controlling playback. This is obviously a very interesting topic and a very important topic. It's just a little bit outside the scope of what we wanted to talk about. So we're not going to be covering any of the methods that you could use in JavaScript to start playback or control playback or receive events when playback changes happen in the player. What we are going to be covering is things that are covered in the documentation on the specific page. So if we pull that up, we'll share that with you. And as I'm going through this demo, a lot of what I'm going to be covering refers to specific web pages. When we go back and post this video on YouTube, I'll have annotations linking to all the web pages so that you could go there and check them out yourself. So this is our main jumping off point for talking about the customization that you could do to the YouTube embedded iframe player. And you could get here from our main developers.google.com/YouTube documentation. And everything in this parameters section in the docs is fair game for what we're going to talk about now. One other thing before I actually get into explaining these parameters is explaining the two different types of ways that you can load the iframe embedded player onto your web page. And we're kind of agnostic as to the way in which you load it. These parameters are going to behave the same way regardless, but I just want to point out that there are two different ways of doing it. The first way is using the iframe's kind of like YouTube player, YT player constructor. And this is a more programmatic way of loading the iframe player onto your web page. So I have this JS fiddle right here that demonstrates what that would look like. It basically involves loading in this JavaScript API and calling the YT player constructor and passing in the ID of a div that's on your page. And you'll see here that there's this player vars section that you could pass in to the YT player constructor. So this is where you get to specify all the options that we're going to be covering today if you're using the YT player constructor. And just quickly jumping over here, this is where I stole that code from. In our Getting Started guide for the iframe API, we talk about how you could actually get that code. So feel free to borrow it from there or from that JS fiddle. The second way that you could load the iframe player onto your page is just with a simple iframe tag that you could add to any web page. And this has the same sort of parameters that the YT player constructor is. Kind of under the hood, they really end up creating the same thing, just that the YT player constructor is a programmatic way of creating this tag using JavaScript. This is if you're just writing out an HTML template, or even if you're not a JavaScript programmer at all and just want to include some HTML on your page, you could use this tag. And the same parameters that we're going to be talking about can go at the very end of the URL that you use as the source of the iframe tag. So over here we have autoplay equals 0 and controls equals 0. And that corresponds to what we're seeing over here for the player vars. And the actual documentation for using that iframe tag is found over here. If you look in the docs over here, we give some examples. So that's kind of the ground rules for how you actually will use these parameters that we're going to be describing in your own code. So I just wanted to run through pretty much from the top all these parameters here. We do have really nice explanations of what they mean in the documentation, so it's going to be a little bit repetitive in some cases, but I did want to highlight some specific ones that are the most useful. So auto hide comes in handy quite a bit. This is something that controls the behavior of the controls, more or less, that are on the bottom of the YouTube player. It's not necessarily the initial state of the controls, but it's more like what happens to the controls once playback starts. And I'm going to demonstrate the ways of setting those different values by going to this page over here, which is our YouTube player demo. So this is another really great resource, and it's kind of an alternative to, you know, writing this code over here or writing this in JS Fiddle. It's just a way to kind of play around with these parameters in a live setting. And you can kind of think of it like our API Explorer, if you've ever used that for our data APIs. This is the equivalent for our player APIs. So what it lets you do is go over here on the right and start choosing different values for the parameters. And I mean, I'm not going to do this for every single parameter that we're going to talk about, but just to show you how you could experiment in real time without having to write any code. Let me just try setting auto hide to 0 over here. I'm going to click update player, and once I begin playback, you can see this is a very old video. Actually, part of what I'm planning on doing is replacing the default video that we use in this demo with this video, so we'll have a very meta experience if you happen to be watching this while on the demo page trying out these parameters. So the main thing to keep in mind, though, is that the controls at the bottom over here did not disappear during playback. And if I were to go over here and change the auto hide to 1, update player, this is loading in the player with the parameters. You'll see that when I mouse over, the controls are there. When I move the mouse away, the controls disappear. So for experiences where you want maybe more of a lean back type situation where people aren't going to be interacting with the controls, or you don't want the controls to overlay the video playback, that's a very useful parameter. Autoplay is next on the list alphabetically. Somewhat self-explanatory. If you add in the autoplay parameter, then the video will start playing back as soon as the page, or as soon as the iframe embed is loaded on the page. I'll give a quick demo of that over here, and this time instead of using the player kind of player demo page, I'm going to use that JS Fiddle that we have set up, and I'm going to just change the autoplay value to 1. I'm going to click run, and you can see here's the embed. It started playing as soon as the page loads. So there's certain scenarios where that's useful, certain scenarios where it's not. You kind of have to use your judgment as to whether autoplaying is the right thing to do. CC load policy is something that controls whether closed captions or subtitles are displayed by default. And the default behavior, if you don't set anything for CC load policy, is that the user's preferences basically on YouTube, there's a way of going in and saying whether you want closed captions or you don't want closed captions. That's normally what takes effect. If you have a specific video and you know that you always want the closed captions to be shown, you could set CC load policy to 1. Color is a bit interesting. It's not something that I see widely used necessarily, but there are some cases where you might want a little bit of flair, let's say, in your player, and you don't want the default behavior. So I'm going to go to the player demo page really quickly and just show you what it does. You can set color to white instead of red, and you update the player. Controls should look slightly different depending upon whether they're red or white. So it just basically changes the branding a little bit on the player. Not necessarily the most useful thing in the world, but it does give you a little bit more control. Speaking of control, next item alphabetically is controls, and this is actually quite useful. There are cases where you could actually see a lot of performance benefits by changing this value from the default to a specific option, which is 2. We have a note in the documentation kind of explaining more about what this does, and if you read the note, it says that controls 2 can give you a performance improvement over the default behavior. And the reason why that is controls 2 kind of has a way of loading the iframe embedded player that does not initialize the underlying Flash player by default.